let people in as they join, but welcome everyone. My name is Elizabeth and I'm the Alumni Director here at UCEAP. Bryn, do you want to introduce yourself real fast?
Hello, everyone. My name is Bryn Lemon. I'm a Scholarships and Alumni Engagement Coordinator in our office in Santa Barbara, and I'm really excited to see you all today.
So we are thrilled that you're here. Just a quick housekeeping. If you see the slide, the presentation, we're excited to have Anne with us today. We do ask that you keep yourself muted during the presentation. If you would like, we also would love to have you change your name temporarily to include where you studied abroad and the years that you were abroad. You can do that by either clicking on your name in the participation or in the window with your picture. Just there's 3 little dots and you can change your name temporarily. We will open it up for Q&A at the end, but we welcome you to enter your questions at any time in the chat. And again, if you have the ability to keep your video on, that's great. It'll make it a little bit more interactive for Anne and our presenter and during the Q&A. But if not, we understand as well. So welcome everyone. And now I'd like to turn it over to our Associate Vice Provost and Executive Director, Vivian Lee Niatre. Thanks, Vivian.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And hello, everybody. I'm so glad that you can take time, especially at this busy time of year, to join us for what I think is going to be a really lovely and interesting presentation by Dr. Anne Walthall, who's Professor Emerita in History at UCI. Anne began her studies of Japanese history, language, and literature at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, after which she completed both an MA and a PhD at the University of Chicago. And I have to say, she was a student there at Chicago at a time when really the greats in the field of Japanese studies were all active. I'm so envious of her training. She was a research student at the University of Kyoto and also at the University of Tokyo. Much of her career has been focused on the exploration of peasant life in early modern Japan. And she paid particular attention to rural entrepreneurship, social protest, and the role that gender played in the construction of class. Over many years, I have to say that my own scholarship has benefited from reading Anne's research on women's invisible presence in Japanese history. Dr. Walthall is the author or co-author of half a dozen books, has several edited volumes to her credit. She's published numerous articles in top-tier journals. And I just recently read her wonderful essay entitled The Hidden Lives of Samurai Women, which is available on Engelsberg Ideas. Not surprisingly, Dr. Walthall has been the recipient of almost every prestigious grant possible in her field, including awards from Fulbright, the Japan Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Social Science Research Council. Really an extraordinary career and an amazing contributor to world scholarship on Japanese history. Turning to UCEAP, Dr. Walthall's history of engagement is similarly sustained and impressive. She was the director of the University of California Study Center in Tokyo from 1993 to 95. And subsequently, she was the director of California's EAP program. So we had some name changes there and some changes over the years. But she was at Meiji Gakuin in 2004, 7, and 2010. And in addition to that, she has been a very active participant in alumni affairs, a contributor to scholarship programs. And it is just such a delight to have her with us today. And she's going to speak about in Japan with California students. So thank you very much, Anne.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be with all of you today. Those of you who've been to Japan on the EAP programs, I'm sure are feeling much of the same nostalgia that I am looking back on those years. And of course, we're so very lucky that we got there at all. As Vivian and I were talking before about how the students who thought they were going to be going to Japan on EAP for the last 2 years have not been able to do so. So let's all count our blessings with that regard, in that regard. And so I want to talk a little bit about the 2 programs I was involved in, which were really quite different. and talk a little bit about some of the students that I met and admired, and some of the students I didn't admire quite so much. But first of all, the programs itself. Those of you who have been to ICU know what a beautiful place it is. It was created right after World War II based on an old, I think it was airfield or armaments plant that was then taken over and turned into this Christian university. So it's the only university in Japan that really looks like an American university with a big campus, and also it's residential, which is unlike other campuses in Japan. You have the students live right there, right next to their classrooms. When I was there in 93 to 95, the dorms, those of you who've been there, were there in the 90s or before, will remember that the dorms were not beautiful. And indeed, they were on the ramshackle side. That was true too for the faculty housing. In fact, the faculty housing for the study center director was so dilapidated that my predecessor's wife had decided that it would not suit her husband's eminent standing. And she had insisted that the California housing for the director be moved off campus, which I think caused enormous problems thereafter, because of course, somebody then had to find the housing. But she found a beautiful house where I was also able to stay out the back gate. So when the gate was open, I could ride my bicycle very conveniently to the office. Since the 90s, I've been back to ICU many times. I had a good friend who taught there. Some of you may have known William Steele, who taught Japanese history there. And over the years, I've seen an enormous transformation. Not only the church has been rebuilt, the dormitories are beautiful now. They tore down all the old dormitories, and so now they look like a modern hotel in many ways. And the faculty are being encouraged to leave those dilapidated houses behind and move into things that look more like townhouses. They've also cut down a lot of trees, which of course gets everybody all upset. But those of you who've been there know that there's the old, the Hong Kong, the main building, which was left over from World War II. It has been refurbished, at least on the inside, but they've kept the outward appearance because it's iconic, so iconic for ICU. And in front of it, they still have the little mounds where students would go and sit in the summer, what are called the bakayama, because if you sit there instead of going to class, you're not going to improve your knowledge, shall we say. Baka means stupid, for those of you who haven't been there. But when I got there in 93, the program had gone through some challenging times because they had been unable to, UCEAP had been unable to find a director the previous year. I had just arrived at California in 91, and I was asked that very first year if I would like to do it. And I said, yes, but my department chair said, you really ought to spend a couple of years here before you go off to Japan. And so reluctantly, I stayed another year here. And then I went in 93. But there had been no study center director for the previous year. That Delmer Brown, who was an eminent figure in Japanese literature, had come out of retirement to fly to Japan 4 times during the course of that year to provide orientation for students and to deal with issues that arose. But the students, I don't know if they expected, obviously they'd expected to have a director there. There wasn't. And there had been various problems that the staff had been unable to solve. In particular, students at Sophia University had decided the summer term in Japan goes very long. It goes into late July. And especially students from Berkeley, whose year then starts again in late August, that gave them almost no summer break whatsoever at all. And so some of them simply left. They left early, they left the dormitories, they didn't tell anybody, they just went home. And the man in Sophia who was in charge of international students there was very annoyed. And so when I got there, I discovered that to demonstrate his annoyance, he had decided to reduce the number of students that Sophia would accept from California. I think he'd gone down maybe by 40%. Anyway, it was a significant problem for us. Sophia University is right in the heart of Tokyo, and students like being there because of that. But he wouldn't provide housing for them. He wouldn't accept them. And I tried to convince him that this was a glitch, a one-time glitch. And he said, you know, Anne, you're like the nurse who arrives at the scene of an accident after the accident has taken place, and you're blamed for all the deaths. I thought, oh, thank you so much. At the time I was running the Tokyo Center, we had programs, one program at Kyushu down in Kyushu that was pretty much on the way out. American students were really not that keen on being so far away. We had a flourishing program at Doshisha. We had several small programs in Tokyo, one at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, which was very successful. There was a lovely student who went there. He was interested in robotics, and that was apparently a center for robotics study. He had almost no Japanese. I said, well, how do you deal with that? And he said, well, you know, the graduate students come from all over the world. They don't know Japanese either. So he fit right in. I had a wonderful time. There was also a program up at the University and Tohoku University up in Sendai. And that one too, the students who went there were small. I think there were three of the small group. There were three of them all together, maybe four, but they really, really loved it. And one of the things I think they liked about it was that, you know, students select on the basis of what they really want. The students who want to have, you know, come to Japan and enjoy the year, who want to be in Tokyo, will oftentimes take ICU because it was easy for them. The housing is there. There are lots of, it's got a big foreign student presence. And there was one guy from Berkeley who admitted at the end of the year that he wished he'd worked a little harder because he thought this was going to be a year where he could just sort of relax and get decent grades and have a good time. And he had a wonderful time. I don't know how many different women I saw him with. But the students at Tohoku were students who were really serious students. And one of them was from Berkeley, one of them was from Riverside. One of them, I think, was maybe Santa Barbara. But I remember them because they were not always together. They developed their own circle of friends and interests. The guy from Riverside was a fascinating man. He was Korean American. His parents were Korean missionaries in Ethiopia, and they had taken him with them to Ethiopia, but after there had been 5 coups d'etat, which had interrupted his schooling entirely too much in their mind, they sent him to the United States, but they were poor being missionaries. So they found a very cheap boarding school for him, which turned out to be something close to a reformatory. And it was tough, but he stuck it out and he went to Riverside. He loved to study. He just thought that was so wonderful to be at a place where he could study. He came to Japan. He worked his tail off. When most of the students went home in the winter during the long winter break, he went up to Hokkaido because he'd never seen snow before. And he ended up going to the University of Chicago, working with my advisor and Bruce Cummings, and getting his PhD in Korean history. He taught for a time at the University of Hawaii, and now he's teaching back at one of the big universities in Korea. But he's a student I'll always remember. In fact, I'm still in touch with him, so it's not surprising. And
Actually, Anne, if I can interrupt you just for a second, he is actually now our faculty liaison at Yonsei University. Yes.
Yes, he's marvelous.
Yes.
He's just
fabulous.
Guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was, you know, he was really a star.
Yeah.
And there was,
No, I was just going to say, well, thank you for mentoring him through, and he continues to be a wonderful mentor for UCEAP students in Korea.
I'll bet he is. He really understands what it's all about because that's where he's from. No, that's great that you've got somebody like him in Korea. No wonder that program does so well. As I said, there was another student I met during my time at ICU, a woman who, after her year in Japan, and I think she graduated, And then she went back to work on the JET program, and they sent her to one of these islands off in the inland sea, a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful island where she was the only foreigner. But she stuck it out and had a wonderful time, very gregarious woman. She learned to ride a bicycle in Japan. That's one of the things I remember about her. And then she went to the University of Michigan Graduate School, and I think now she's a professor of anthropology. So there were a couple of people like that. There were a couple of students who screwed up, but I don't have to talk about them. I think what I should do, I'm nattering on, is talk a little bit about the Meigaku program, the Meiji Gaku and Daigaku program, which is a very different program. At ICU, I was an administrator. I was talking to other administrators. I was interviewing students who were coming from Japan to the United States. I was making sure that the UC students didn't get into too much trouble. At Meigaku, I was there not as a director, but as visiting professor. They have a small program in, I think it's global peace studies, something like that. And they would take I was a historian, I don't know anything about global peace studies, but anyway, I had a wonderful time there. In contrast to the old ICU campus, their campus was out beyond Yokohama at a place called Totsuka. It's a beautiful campus, small, and the program for the UC students is also very small. They would have maybe 25, I think, at the most. The idea was that because it was a peace studies program, the students would come in for a semester, and then we would take them down to Hiroshima to go to the Peace Park. And we also had a high school teacher who would take us around the area near Hiroshima, a place called Kure, where during World War II, airplanes and submarines had been built in caves in the mountains. And he would take us into those caves, and we would stand there, and you could still see the concrete on the floor. The machinery had all been taken away. And he would have us turn off the flashlights, all of our flashlights, and imagine what it was like to work in these caves when it was hot and noisy and poor lighting. It was mainly women, of course, who were doing this kind of work. Many of the things that they were building were the suicide submarines, where it was one way only for them. But then they also had inside the mountains, they also had these big industrial plants where they built airplanes. His view always was that Japan deserved to be bombed, that Hiroshima deserved to be bombed because it had military bases all around it. And a couple of times we took students to what is now the Naval Training Facility, which during the war was the Imperial Naval Training Facility. So names may change, but the function still remains the same. And then after we would go to the Peace Park and see the remains of these caves, we would then go to Ikitsujima and see the shrine there and climb. And I found out that if I climbed the mountain behind the shrine, I could get the students to climb the mountain too. And the view of the inland sea was fabulous. That was one of the things I enjoyed. Not so much the 4-hour train ride it took to get there, but that's okay. The thing that was different for me was I was a professor, I was teaching, I was interacting directly with the students, which I much preferred to being an administrator. But I also found that the students themselves had changed. When I was at ICU in the 90s, students could communicate back home pretty much on email, but it was on the clunky side. By the time I got to Meigaku in the 90s, there are a couple of things that happened. One is most students no longer want to do year-long programs. And I'm sure, Vivian, you found that to be sure across the board. They wanted shorter term programs because they had obligations back home. It was expensive, and shorter term program is cheaper. And in many ways, that sort of follow along with what Japanese students wanted too, because Japanese students don't like to spend too long abroad in their junior year, especially because that's when they need to be looking for jobs. And that's when the job hunt starts. And if you're not part of it from the beginning, you can, when the jobs are tight, that can really sink you. So on the one hand, students wanted a shorter term program. At Megaku, sorry, they didn't have to take language if they didn't want to. And some of them didn't want to. When I was there, the language I guess my class was early. If they took the language program, then it made it harder to get into Tokyo if you wanted to go enjoy Tokyo in the evening. But the main difference was that students all had cell phones. And once the smartphones, not just a cell phone, but the smartphones with affordable international calling programs. And so what I found is that students would come staggering into class, half awake because they'd been up until 3 or 4 a.m. talking to their friends back in the States. And I always felt, in many cases, almost all cases, I sort of felt that the students always had 1 foot back here and only 1 foot in Japan. And I was really saddened to see that, because I felt that the students I'd met in the 90s had a much deeper engagement with Japan. And Japan is not a country that's easy to get to know. You may think you know it because you can go to a bar and chat up the men in the bar if you're a man, or if you're a woman too. But there are layers upon layers upon layers to Japanese society and the way and Japanese interactions. And if you're going to spend half of your time on the phone, maybe your evenings on the phone with your friends back here, or if you're going to stick with the people in your dorm, and Megaku has a dorm for UCI, for the California students, it really limits the amount of interaction you have with the host country. And so that's something that concerns me still. I don't know if the Megaku program with its visiting professor is continuing or not. I really loved it. I thought it was, the students, I think, got an opportunity to meet some very interesting faculty who would come down to talk to them. And I think that going to Hiroshima was a very good thing for them to do. Anyway, so I think I've talked for more than 20 minutes. So I'll stop now and take any questions you might have. Or I could talk about how beautiful Megaku is in the fall with the autumn leaves, and in the spring when you can see Mount Fuji with the cherry blossoms.
The faculty program is not running, but we're hoping to institute some short duration, sort of scholar in residence programs to enable more faculty to be able to go and meet their colleagues. A lot of the STEM faculty can't leave their laboratories for so long. So we're looking for ways to, pull people from across the system. So there are changes in the works.
Well, things are always changing, and I know that the study directorship, the study center directorship is no longer there.
Right.
For the longer term, which is too bad. Because I do wonder about, having come in after there hadn't been a director for a year and seeing some of the things that could happen, I do wonder about how much, what's going on with the students now at ICU. Especially as I remember the Pomona students had nobody supervising them, and I don't think they went to class.
Well, I see Ben Borton has his hand up, but I'll just quickly say that the study center itself is still there. So many of and it's an experienced staff. So some of those things they have taken over. We also have a faculty liaison from the faculty at ICU who also works with the study center staff together. So they're not bereft.
Okay.
And we find for lots of reasons that it's working pretty well. It can always be tweaked, but it's working pretty well. So I'll let Ben ask his question.
Maybe he could, ask it rather than having to raise hands, because I can't, I've got this thing so backlit, I can't see anything. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Vivian and Professor Walthall. This is partly a question, partly a comment. I was at the Tokyo Education Abroad Center in 1969, along with my friend Tom Plum, who's also on this Zoom. And it was an extremely turbulent time on that campus and in Japan, as it was in the United States. You recall the student movement was at its zenith in the US. It also was in Japan. We arrived at ICU when it was closed due to a student strike, although I gather a few faculty participated. And eventually, riot police or Kido-Tai were called in. At least one of the female students, a Japanese student, was severely enough injured that she needed to be carried to a hospital. And I wonder if there is any remembrance of those days for those of you, including our keynote speaker, when you were at ICU. By the way, we too, Tom and I and a few others, thought that was not an appropriate atmosphere for study and participated in a nonviolent demonstration. And our University of California professor dismissed us from school, even though we were not expelled or dismissed from ICU. So we were condemned to interesting times.
I have some friends who participated in those things. I don't suppose you ever met Bill Steele, who was at ICUs. I've heard his stories about it. Also, a guy I know, Takayama Yoshiki, was a Japanese student there at the
Not
time.
familiar.
Okay. Well, there are enough students there, you probably wouldn't run into all of them. No, I think Bill may have been there a couple of years earlier, but it was a stormy time there. And ICU has done its very best to make sure that no remembrance of that remains at all.
No history, no recorded accounts of those of
Certainly not that I know of. I mean, I just know from my personal connections about some of the things that happened there, but there's certainly.
Does the name Hans Berwald ring a bell at all?
No.
Yeah, he was the UCLA professor who dismissed us from school. And we thought that was
a little
a transgression of our First Amendment rights, which were being honored by among Japanese students. We eventually were reinstated.
I don't, I was not in California then. I was in Wisconsin, which also went through its share of troubles.
Yeah.
Those were interesting times. No, all we had to deal with in the 90s were the Bosozoku, the motorcycle gangs that would decide at 2 a.m. that it would really be fun to ride their motorcycles up the street, the row of cherry blossoms and circle around and then ride back. And the guards, that's when they had those big gates there. And if the guards could hear them coming, they would get those gates shut very quickly to prevent them from coming onto campus. Then you could hear them roaring up and down the road and back. But that was as much disruption as I ever noticed.
Thank you so much for sharing, Ben and Anne as well. Let's move on to Amy Ambrose's question, which is, Professor Walthall, any parts of Japan that you still haven't visited? Are there any places to recommend that are off the beaten path?
The place that I have not visited that I would love to go to is Kumano, where there's a waterfall, the Nachi waterfall, and it's a pilgrimage site from from long ago. As to places that are off the beaten track, it depends on what you're interested in. A few years back, I went to a place called Takachiho, Takachhiho, that's up in the mountains of Kyushu, and it's said to be a place, one of the places where the sun goddess hid herself in a cave until she was lured out by a lascivious dance. And at that point, she came out of the cave, and she was drawn out of the cave, and the rock was put across the door entrance so she could never go back in. And it's a famous story in Japanese myth. And Takachiho is I mean, there are various sites around Japan that say this is the cave, but Takachiho has the biggest one. And it's also a site where it's a spiritual hotspot. And there's a big sign now that says this is a spiritual hotspot. So if you go there, it's supposed to increase your spirit. Anyway, it's beautiful, beautiful area. I mean, if you know, those of you who've been to Japan know it's a beautiful country. So that one's really off the beaten track. Another place that I'm not sure how far off you want to get. Another place that's lovely is Takayama in Hida Takayama, which again is beautiful. The Kiso Valley is beautiful.
Yeah.
And you can walk. There's a walking trail that goes from one of the old post stations to another down the Kiso Trail.
We did the Nakasendo like 4 years ago with our friends. And we went from Nantoka Kara Nantoka Made. I can't remember. It's called like Tamago and then the end of the line.
Tamago and Magome.
So. We did that one because we read about it in the New York Times, and we finally went to Kanazawa for the first time. And we've been to Shikoku a number of times to do the Hachijuha Kasho. But we're always, my husband's from Hiroshima, so we're always looking for places to go. We love hearing other people's like what they find, the mud baths or whatever. So these are good recommendations, especially in Kyushu.
Well, if you want to go north, you might try Kaku no Date up in Akita.
Oh, Kaku no Date.
Maybe they call it Kaku Date. It's an old. It was a fortified town on the border of Akita Domain, and there are a number of samurai houses that still remain.
Oh, very nice.
And there's also a lovely graveyard to people who died in the War of 1868.
Very interesting.
So that one's a little harder to get to. Aizu, again, Aizu, Fukushima is very interesting.
Yeah. We've been to Fukushima, yeah.
Have you been to Aizu?
Many years ago, like 30 years ago, but yeah. I love your suggestions.
Okay.
Thank you. We're actually going to take a friend who's also she's been a faculty at UC Berkeley for many years, and now she's at University of Washington, but she doesn't have, her left leg was removed because of cancer like 30 years ago. And she was just saying to us last night that they want to go to Japan with us on a trip. And now the only times I've been where I've had to worry about ambulation was when I had my twins, and I took them by myself a couple of times to see my in-laws when they were babies. And now we're going to take our friend. So now that's a new trip I've got to design so that she doesn't have too many steps and that kind of thing. But
that one's going to be tough.
Yeah. It was tough enough with a stroller. It had twin stroller in the year 2001, but
yeah.
No, anyway.
Steps, Japan and steps are synonymous, I think. We have a question I'd like to go back to, and your observation about students changing and wanting, shorter stays. And so we have, and see if I can get the whole name here. Eric Lin was in Japan from 2003 to 4. And he says that he didn't feel like he was integrating until maybe 4 months in. And being on the year-long program really helped drive home the lived experience rather than feeling like a visitor. So he's curious about your thoughts as to how it might be possible to provide that same kind of immersive experience with shorter stays. Is it possible?
I think so much of it's up to the students. One of the things I liked about the program at Meiji Gakuin is that they would assign buddies to each UC student. And usually it was more than one, be 2, sometimes 3 3 Japanese students for 1 American student. And I think that those American students who took advantage of that system, because here they've got somebody who has, they've somehow, the Meiji Mengaku family would try to match them up. And I think students who took advantage of that had more opportunity for a more immersive experience. There were also some students, not very many, who would want a homestay. And of course, that can help too. Although some homestays were better than others, I discovered. But the real problem, I think, the student has to be really motivated and keep the phone off at night. I don't know what you do about that. I think it really depends on the individual student. Some students, I know it takes time to sort of pull yourself out of the ooze of America and put yourself in the ooze of Japan. I think that's why I think the year-long programs are such an advantage, but very few students have the time to do that anymore. But I do think that the buddy system is one of the few things I've seen that can help if the students take advantage of it.
One thing that I recall from when I was a student in Taiwan was that the government actually at that time provided a wealth of opportunities for seeing things that you wouldn't normally see if you were just going back and forth between the university and home, whatever that was. And we do have a question actually from David Voltering, who was in Göttingen, who asked if you could say more about any kinds of outings that were arranged for the UCEAP students, and did the local government offer trips or receptions? Did you visit temples with them? What were the kind of ways to get them off the campus?
Well, it depends on the program again. And I'll speak more about the Mengaku program because it's fresher in my mind. The Mengaku faculty had things for students every week, and they would take them. I mean, aside from going down to Hiroshima, there were also other programs they could sign up for, everything from tea ceremony to trips around the Yokohama and Tokyo area to see, that was focused specifically on getting them out, getting them away from Totsuka to see different parts of Japan. There was one faculty member there named Tom Gill, I don't know if he's still there or not, who was working on, whose work was with day laborers and the homeless people in Yokohama. And he took the students, I went on that one, I found it fascinating. He took the students to talk to some of the a Filipino day laborer whose status in Japan was, shall we say, ambiguous, and to show them the tent cities along the rivers and to talk to them about how people end up there, why they stay there, because Japan tries very hard to get people off the streets, and to give them some idea of, of a different world than they would be used to. It unfortunately came the very day that a typhoon was coming, and some of the students were unhappy that we'd taken them to put their lives in danger. They all got home safely. But anyway, they do things like that. We went off to see the fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon fishing boat that was in the way of the Bikini Atoll when the Americans dropped the hydrogen bomb there. I don't know if you've heard about that, but the fishing boat, they had this fishing boat, and it was the sailors on it were doused with a lot of radiation. The fish were doused with a lot of radiation, but the boat is in a monument now on the shores of Tokyo Bay. So they were saying the staff at Mengaku worked very hard to get the students out and about. They went to plays, they went to concerts. Some of the students, again, it depends on the students. Some of the students were really self-motivated. There was one guy there who was interested in musicology, and he wrote a fascinating paper on noise. Apparently, this is a movement in avant-garde music. It was a very interesting paper, and he would go off every weekend to Tokyo to these places where noise was performed. So no, I think I don't know that the government was sponsoring any of this. That's not something I remember hearing about, but certainly the universities tried very hard. The faculty, staff at the universities at ICU, I do remember, would make arrangements for students to participate in these tours. Not all students did. It was up to them.
Yeah, thank you.
Professor Walthall, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Yeah, commenting on the excursions, one of the finer points of our stay in 1969 was the preliminary stay or trip around Japan, where we were introduced to many things. The university, in coordination with ICU and hiring a travel guide, took us to just about any place we could have chosen ourselves to go. It took about 9 days, and they had to extend it to 17 days because there was no campus to bring us back to at that time. It was all under strike. And all of that was done without additional cost. Gosh knows where that came from. But I know there were a lot of negotiations about the extended stay of the UC students, because if we'd been brought back to the campus at a particular time and introduced to the campus, it would have been seen as strike breaking. The students reacted very badly to us being introduced into the campus at that time, so they kept us away. And it was a wonderful trip, but it was a formative introduction to what we faced as we as we did get integrated into the campus for the coming year.
I certainly, except for the trip to Hiroshima for the Meigaku students, I don't think they do that anymore.
It was a lot of work, and it was mostly the director's responsibility for making sure it came off. So you were lucky that that was not responsibility of yours.
Well, I think part of the problem too was in 69, I first went to Japan in 67. And at that time you got 360 yen to the dollar.
Yeah.
And then after the Nixon shocks of the 70s, the dollar started dropping like a stone. And now it's a little over 100 yen to the dollar. And this was in the glory years of Japan, the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, when Japan's economy was just taking off and things were getting very expensive. And so I think that one of the real differences between the time that you were there and by the time I got there in the 90s is that Japan was really pricing itself out of the market. One of the things that's happened since 89 is that the Japanese economy, Japan has suffered either no inflation or a little deflation. And so I set lunch in a local restaurant that used to cost 1,000 yen, can now sometimes cost 700 yen. And that's, to my mind, shocking. I've never imagined that the price of food, and it's the same meal. You get your soup, your rice, your vegetables, and some kind of meat dish. My favorite being grilled mackerel. But it's the prices. Some things have gone down in price. The yen dollar thing has remained around 100 yen to the dollar. Sometimes it's dropped below down to 80, which is really tough. Sometimes it goes up to 123 or something like that. But it's nothing like as cheap as it was in the 60s.
Well, to confirm that, what you're saying there, every night we stayed in the traditional ryokan.
Yeah.
Might have been multiple nights in the same place. It was really quite wonderful. And I don't think I could afford to stay in many nights on a trip, vacation day. They're very expensive now.
Oh, yeah. But you can always stay in the Minshuku, but
Oh, these were ryokans. These are the traditional.
I know. But I'm saying if you go there now, the step down that's more affordable is the Minshuku. These are housing. I mean, it's sort of like a ryokan in that you sleep on tatami, but you don't have the fancy meals and you don't have the wonderful service. And usually you have a decent bath, but you also share bathing facilities and toilet facilities. And at my advanced age, I prefer a business hotel, which are cheap. You can stay in a business hotel for $50 a night per person. But they're not the beautiful ryokan.
Right.
On the other hand, they're a lot easier on the knees.
Okay, we did have a question about dormitory accommodations, and actually Kazumi Onagawa from our Tokyo Study Center responded. Most of the new ICU dorms are for both Japanese and international students, but students who are in one term only program stay in a dorm that's isolated for international students.
Really? I did not know that. That's too
So
bad. That sort of makes them even more isolated if they're only there for one term.
yeah, yeah. On the other hand, the way that we look at it is that students go for a short term because that's what works in for them financially or academically. But we know that they, as we say, they have drunk the Kool-Aid. Now they want to do this. They are part of the club. They've gotten the bug and they will go back at other points in life. So, whether it's through marriage, as with Amy Ambrose, or whether it's through friends or business or just on their own, I think even having a short stay taste really makes such a difference in their lives. And this is why we also want to have faculty engagement so that they can see this, promote it, and help the students the way you did for years and years.
Well, I hope that helps them. I'm glad, I'm glad you see positive benefit to these really short-term programs, because I think that they may benefit students in the long run, but as a faculty person, I do wonder about the academic content.
Yeah, we can appreciate that, and we try and keep an eye on it. And I'm a person who, when I went somewhere, it was very hard to tear me away. I went to Taiwan, and I didn't leave for 3.5 years. So I
That's
completely
you, Vivian.
I completely understand. So, but at any rate, but thank you. This was so very interesting. Are there other questions? I'm not seeing any more in the chat, Bryn.
Well, I have a further follow-up. By the time you arrived in ICU as an administrator, did they still maintain the program that staff, professors, and administrators had to do night duty, night patrol once a week?
No, no.
You escaped that one.
They still, they still had the storms. For those of you who don't know, storms are when the men's dormitory will decide spontaneously, I guess, you probably know more about this than I do, that they would take off all their clothes and go running around the women's dorms, right?
That was after, well, nothing was normal about the dorms, I think, when Ben and I were there.
Oh,
So
okay.
we didn't see that, I don't think. Ben, did you see it? No.
Okay.
And
Well,
speaking of history,
it was something that people talked about when I was there.
Yeah, I think some of the storms were closed. Yes, that went on once in a while. I wasn't a participant, but yeah, it was kind of light. I do remember a Japanese American exchange student, from University of California, who wasn't ready for the storm, teaching them the S word in English when they arrived. She was not a happy camper.
So, but I suspect that the night patrol had something to do with that, but I certainly don't know that my friends ever talked to, the Steeles lived on the ICU campus until shortly before he retired. And I don't recall him talking about night patrols.
well, they were actually security. I mean, like you say, it was an open range land, forested, with no gates, no fences, essentially.
Okay, that's something that did change then, because by the time I was there in '93, they had fences around the entire campus.
Yeah,
and
we know why too, yeah.
And they had, there was a big gate, there was the main entrance with a gate that rolled back and forth. And then there were gates, there were two other entrances. One sort of on the south and one that was called the back gate, that they would close at night. And they had staff that patrolled, but I don't these were regular security people, men, who would walk around in their security outfit, their gray outfit with their yellow vesty type of thing.
Well, it was a duty of the UC professor to do that along with his fellow professors.
Not by 95, not by 93, it wasn't. And what I remember was trying to, those gates closed awfully early. And if the place where I was living was out the back gate. And I can remember, going back and the front gate you could always get out of because there was always somebody there, but it was a long way around. And so I would climb over that back gate. I was a lot more limber than those days. Or I figured out a way that you could sort of work between the gate and the houses that it was, came up close to, and ease my way around there. I had to be careful to make sure no one saw me. But it was, and my friends used to, at New Year's at midnight, you want to go do your first shrine visit, right? Or temple visit. And the gate would be closed. And yes, you could go all the way around through the main gate, but it was so much easier just to climb over the back gate. So that, and I'm sure that if faculty could climb those gates, that students could too.
We have one more question for you, Anne. Were you involved in planning the Tsuru University program? It seems to have been, it felt very special since it was a very small group with only one student from each UC accepted. And was I'm sorry, I don't have my list of participants up here again to see who CM was, but the questioner, felt that was very special and wondered if you had a hand in it.
No, I think that one started after I left. As you know, UC is forever reformulating and deciding which universities it's going to be affiliated with and which ones it isn't. And I think I was on a planning committee when they decided that Sophia University was no longer worth it. But I was not part of, I know about the Tsuru program, and from what I've been told, it was a lovely program and the students were very happy who went to it. And that was one, getting back to Eric's question, where it was a short-term program, a semester long, I think, or a quarter long. But because it was so small and the Tsuru students were so welcoming, it really helped the American students get more integrated into student life than they would have been, say, at some of the other universities. So no, I think it is now in abeyance, I believe, and that's really too bad. Am I right on that?
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, I believe so. We've had it was an interesting time, and actually Japan was sort of the ground where all of this happened. After the financial restructuring in 2008-9, there was a real push to develop more programs, to just get more live bodies out there. And the way forward was seen to develop more programs. And the regional director at the time in East Asia was very successful in creating a number of new partnerships in Japan. And a number of new programs, but many of them were very small, either because the partner didn't want so many UC students there to overwhelm them, or or we were afraid that there wouldn't be enough students coming in to make an exchange viable. So they were kept rather small. But the problem is that the campuses found it very challenging. What's the difference among all of these many, many programs here? How do I advise students to go to this place rather than that place? And they began, urging us to consider consolidating some of the ones that were away from urban areas, didn't attract as many students and so forth. So there were a variety of reasons, and that was part of this kind of ebb and flow. And it was very sad because there were some wonderful programs that we just had to let go. The cost of producing the budgets, advising, maintaining everything just outweighed the advantage for us.
Yeah, and I know at one point it looked like the whole program was, EAP was going to go down because the president's office was not particularly supportive of it.
Well, the previous directors, they weathered that and got us on good financial footing, and we've tried to be good stewards since that time. Right now, I can reassure everybody that we're on pretty sound financial footing. We enjoy a great deal of appreciation from the Office of the President. And our relationships with the campuses, I think, are improving day by day. Instead of being competitors, we're trying to figure out how do we work together to serve more and more UC students in a better way.
How many students, of course, right now there are no students in Japan. But before in 2019, say, do you have numbers for how many students were there?
I should, but I don't. And unfortunately, our regional director, our program director for that area is out of the office and is not on the call right now. But
We
we
can
had
send it out, Vivian, when we send
Yeah, we
out the
can
link
send
to the
it, yeah.
video. I'll include that
Oh,
in the
great.
link.
That'll be great.
We can
Yeah.
do a
Oh,
quick
yeah, we're
search.
running out of time here. Yeah,
All
we'll
right.
send that out.
One quick question for Professor Walthall. Is Professor Steele active or alive or
Oh, he's
teaching?
definitely alive, but he had, in Japan, they have set retirement ages.
Uh-huh.
And he started teaching at ICU in 1980, and he retired, well, let's see, he's a couple of years younger than I am. So he retired, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago.
Yeah, he used to teach a course on the history of ICU. So I think there is history available that he would be aware of if anybody was just able to reach
Yeah, he
him.
taught a lot of local history courses on Mitaka too, and he would take students around Mitaka to show them some of the historical sites, like
That's how he impressed Dr. Brown, because he went out and got involved in local history and discovered some evidence of Buddhist shrines on the campus back in 1967, I think.
Oh, okay.
So that
sounds
very
like-
much impressed his director and his professors. He had a good career after that.
Yeah, no, he showed me where the grave of Kondo Isami is, who's the leader of the Shinsengumi, very popular with young women. I don't know quite why. But it's out the back gate and down the hill.
Okay, so was that on campus?
No, it's out the back gate
Oh,
and down
out
the
back,
hill on
yeah.
the outside it's outside the campus itself, yeah. But they have a dig there at ICU. They found various relics from the Jomon area. And they have their own archaeological site where they can train students in archaeology.
Great.
It's an amazing campus.
Yena Lamb from UCEAP's research team tells us that we had 260 students in Japan in 2019-20.
Wow, that's incredible. It must be those short-term programs do it then, huh?
Well, and also 2019-20, that would have meant that the spring, starting in April, would have been canceled. So
Yeah.
that wasn't even a full year's complement.
Wow.
So I think pretty regularly we have well over 300 students a year.
That's great news. I'm very glad to hear that. I guess I will shout about the disadvantages of the short-term programs then. I'll try to anyway.
I know we're running out of time, and if anyone has to drop off, that's we hate to see you go. But Kazumi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the great programs you have going on right now with the alumni and internships and mentoring. Would you be willing to say a little bit about what's going on?
Okay. Iwato Sensei. I don't know if you remember me, but I was working for the Tokyo Study Center since 2004. I remember you visited our office when Professor Ino was a director.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, we have a lot of different programs. Programs that have changed, since you were there. But more shorter programs. But there are, like you said, it really depends on the student, how they can immerse themselves in the society. We've seen a lot of students who participated in shorter programs. They are so active. They join student clubs, and we have developed volunteer or internship too. So some of them, try to join those very actively. But I guess it's really depend on the students. But yeah, I think a lot of students, the number of students have increased. I believe Japan programs are still popular. Can't wait to welcome students, in the near future, really.
I know that somebody would like to go. I assume though that at this point there are no positions in Japan available for UCI, for UC faculty?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, well, I enjoyed my time. You know, I spent 5 years there altogether, and or more or less most of 5 years there, and I found it a very rewarding experience.
Yeah. I was a faculty director in the Netherlands for a couple of years, and I completely agree. And there are lots of reasons for the diminishing number of study center directorships, but we are hopeful that having a scholar in residence program going forward will enable faculty to learn more about our study centers and about what students do when they're on UCEAP, and provide maybe some meaningful research relationships as well that students can draw on going forward.
But you're trying to put those more in STEM programs rather than humanities, it sounds like.
Not by design, no, it would be open to anyone. But what we have found is that the number of faculty applying for these positions has dropped. And, sometimes we end up having to knock on doors and say, how would you like to go back and do it again?
Yeah, sure.
And so, sometimes we have to do that. Sometimes it's tax treaties that have made things really challenging for us. There's a variety of reasons. Some faculty are more research focused than student focused, and that has its challenges and so forth.
Yes, well, it is awfully easy when you're there to think, okay, this is their project and let's go for it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, your campus will forget about you and not know who you are. There's tension between the professors and the directors back in the 60s, and I don't know thereafter, with their own faculty when they take off 1 to 2 years to be at Tokyo was great. And they weren't always happy with the results of their return.
Sometimes
I was never, when I was a Tokyo Studies Center director, I was not full-time. I came back here to Irvine in the winter and taught.
Yeah.
Winter is a low period in Japan anyway. And frankly, the reason why I did that was because I had 2 dogs and I couldn't find housing for them in Japan. And so I would come back in the winter and I would come back then in part of the summer too. And of course, when I was doing the Meigaku program, that was only spring and fall. And so I would come back here at the end of, right before Christmas, and then go back in April when the Japanese year started again. So I never had that. That was never a problem for me. The great advantage to running EAP was that every time somebody said, "And we need a department chair," I would say, "Oh, sorry, I've already committed to go to Japan."
Trade-offs.
So by the time you were there was no evidence of a student movement in the country, or nothing really substantial or significant?
By the 90s, not really. I can remember in the 80s when I would be in Tokyo, I would see students, a little demonstration marching down the streets with the police all shepherding it to make sure no cars hit it or anything like that. But by the 90s, no.
Yeah. Oh, they were massive in the cities in Tokyo.
Yeah, that's gone.
Connected with the US military, and the treaty too.
Yeah, no, I mean, Ampo Hantai was a big
Yeah.
issue. The Vietnam War was huge, and then
Right.
there was the way the universities were organized, it was huge too, but that's no longer there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think we're out of time, and it's been wonderful to see you. Thank you, Professor Walthall. It's been lovely. I really love the institutional history and knowledge you have of those years when we just don't hear a lot about that time. We hear a lot about the 60s, but we don't hear a lot about the 80s and the 90s, and so I appreciate that. I also love that we see so many regulars on the call today, but we also have a number of new people that had the first time on. So I think that this subject has been a little bit different than a lot of our other UCAP presents. So thank you again. Thank you, everyone. Bryn and I will be sending out an email with a link to the video, so feel free to share that with other people who maybe couldn't make it today.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. It's very nostalgic for me to look back on those years. I had a wonderful time and I met some wonderful students.
Well, thank you. Yes. Lovely to see you. Thanks, everyone.
Absolutely.
Thank you
Thank you.
all.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Let's see.